So as we look at all of this news coverage right now, including the aftermath of the Trump visit, the question I think I want to start with is this fundamentally changing potentially the relationships with Europe, or is this more a matter of a new president with a new approach? He was elected to have a new approach, ruffling some diplomatic feathers, not sort of talking the way diplomats normally talk.
David, I think it's a bit of both. President Trump has an entirely different style. It's bruising, it's bull in the china shop. That's something that the Europeans have not seen in an American president before. And on the European side, David, it's politics. Donald Trump is supremely unpopular in Europe, and Angela Merkel's running in a tough campaign against Martin Schulz and the Social Democrats. So this is good politics for her to say what she did over the weekend, which is that Europe needs to go its own way. But in the main, I think this is deep substantive disagreements on trade, on the nature of free trade, on climate change, where the president hasn't committed to the Paris Accords, on Russia, where the Europeans perceive President Trump to be the weakest American president since the Second World War, not defending them on Russia. And I think that the major problem here is that the Europeans perceive that President Trump personally is not supportive of the European Union, to a lesser extent NATO. And for the Europeans, the European Union, of course, is their primary, the primary institution that they've built since the Second World War. And as for the tweet this morning, President Trump is describing Germany as a competitor economically, not as an ally. That's a major change in American foreign policy.
Well, let's put up that tweet so that all of our viewers can read it along with us. And basically what he said was, we have a massive, all caps, massive trade deficit with Germany. Plus they pay, again, all caps, far less than they should on NATO and military. Very bad for U.S. This will change. So, Nick, this is not, the NATO contributions is not a change with prior policy of the United States. I mean, President Obama's administration advocated larger contributions to defense as well. This is not really changing U.S. policy, is it?
No, in fact, you know, President Trump is right on the issue that the Europeans are not paying, most of the Europeans are not paying enough for their defense. They're supposed to have hit a floor of 2% of gross domestic product on their defense spending. Germany's at 1.2%. 20 of the 28 countries are below. And so he's got a point. The problem is, how do you be effective with the Europeans? Is the most effective thing to isolate them, humiliate them, stand them up at a NATO ceremony in Brussels the way he did? Probably not. My experience, I think the experience more importantly of prior American presidents, is you're probably better working with them behind the scenes. If you try to embarrass them publicly, especially in election year for Angela Merkel, it's not going to be effective. So he just needs to learn what's effective here, and I don't think he chose the right instrument last week.
Well, Nick, you keep bringing up the fact it's an election year in Germany. Words matter, but where they're said and who the audience is matters a little bit more as well. A beer tent in Munich, if you were going to really pitch and put forward a break of the transatlantic alliance, that's not really where you choose to do it, especially from someone like Chancellor Merkel. So would she have made these comments if there was not an election this year?
Well, I think she's reflecting the fact that they had, at the G7 meeting in Sicily last week, there was a series of disagreements. And I listed them on trade, climate change, and Russia, as well as on NATO. And this was her first public appearance in Munich following that conference, her first opportunity. This is not a breakup of NATO. NATO's going to continue. But I worry, as an American, that our leadership of the NATO alliance and the credibility that we've had since Harry Truman in Europe is going to diminish if President Trump doesn't begin to talk as respectfully to the Europeans as he's talking to the Saudi king and the Israeli prime minister. That was a tale of two cities last week, the Trump trip. I thought he did rather well in the Middle East, but he didn't show the open respect and deference to the European leaders that he certainly showed to the authoritarian leadership in the Gulf. And a lot of people have commented upon that. It's a strange way to act because these are our best friends in the world, Europe. We need them on lots of different issues. So as a matter of self-interest and leadership, I don't see why the United States would want to diminish its own role in Europe.
So Nick, play out the geopolitics here a moment. Does Vladimir Putin wake up this morning, actually visiting France, does he wake up this morning and see this as an opportunity for him to drive a wedge here and perhaps have some advantages, whether commercial or strategic, in Europe that perhaps he didn't have the day before yesterday?
Putin is trying to get the sanctions lifted, the economic sanctions over the Ukraine issue. He's making some inroads, as the New York Times reported, in Italy, And he certainly is trying to divide the European Union from the United States. But interestingly, David, the very young and inexperienced president of France, Emmanuel Macron, I thought showed us how to deal with Putin. He received Putin at Versailles yesterday, and then he complained publicly to Putin about Russian interference in the French elections, the role of Russia TV and of Sputnik, and he also took after Putin over human rights violations. I think that's the way to deal with the Russians. Openly, clearly, disagree with them when you have to. Quite a contrast from President Trump's kid gloves treatment of the Russian government.
So Nick, go back to trade for a moment, of great importance, obviously, to businesses and to financial markets. Is President Trump talking to the right people? When he's talking about these trade deficits, the European Union has a trade deal with the United States, as I understand it. It's not done country by country. And similarly, Mario Draghi runs monetary policy. He has more of an effect over the strength of the euro than Angela Merkel does. Shouldn't he be talking to Tusk and to Draghi rather than to Merkel?
In a way, yes. I mean, certainly Merkel is the most powerful politician in Europe from the most powerful country. But you're right, David. The European Union negotiates all trade agreements on behalf of all members, and that's done as a bloc. And Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank is the most important economic official in the continent. And so the Trump administration needs to begin to deal with the EU directly on those matters.
Do you have any reason at this point to believe, Nick, that the president and his team may have learned from this experience and may actually have some course correction?
Well, I hope so. He has some people around him, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, certainly H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, who understand that, you know, we need the Europeans to continue fighting with us in Afghanistan. We need them to maintain the sanctions against Russia. We need them to isolate Iran and to make sure Iran it adheres to the nuclear deal. Those are just 3 examples. But David, as we've talked before on your program, Europe's our largest trade partner. It's our largest investor. It's our largest accumulation of allies in the world. So I think that President Trump needs to understand who he's talking to here. He needs to understand how to motivate them. He's right on some of the issues. He just hasn't figured out a way to deal with them effectively.
Nick, if we assume from the US side that this may well be a process of creative destruction, what's the objective here, and what's the system that comes out of the other side, at least from the standpoint of the US and this administration?
Well, if you look at the tweet this morning, but more importantly, what President Trump said in Sicily and Brussels, President Trump seems to be prioritizing economic relations and trade specifically. He's diminishing, really, the role of Europe as a security partner, a military partner vis-a-vis containment of Russia. And so he describes Europe in a way that's quite harsh in terms of its trade advantage with the United States. I think that's the space to watch. Will the Trump administration, after this very tough assault on the Europeans, decide that they do want ultimately the kind of free trade agreement that Barack Obama had in mind, where the 2 largest global economies, Europe and the United States, come together to lower barriers to trade?